Welcome everyone. My name is Jennifer Osler and I am Portfolio Lead for English and the Arts at AQA, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to our SLT Insights Summer Term webinar. We're joined by teachers, SLT, middle leaders and colleagues from across the sector today, and you are all very welcome. I'm delighted to introduce this afternoon David Didau. Many of you will require no introduction to David. He is a teacher, an education leader, and has for over a decade been providing a brain food for the thinking teacher. He writes on education, comments on education, challenges on education, and that spans from detailed classroom practice to policy making. David joins us today to focus on what I believe is our most valuable resource in education, and that is our people, and how we can get the very best out of teachers to ensure schools thrive. So before I hand over to David, just a couple of housekeeping notes. We are recording the session today, so you'll be able to catch up on it later and share it with your colleagues. We'll also be taking questions in the Q&A box in this Teams channel. Please do pop your questions in the Q&A. When you submit them, they will disappear, but we have captured them behind the scenes, and at the end of David's presentation, we have made a little bit of time to ask him any questions that you've submitted, and we'll be able to follow up to you after the session with any questions we haven't had time to get to. So without further ado this afternoon, I'd like to hand over to David to get started with his presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jen. Jen and I spent a little bit of time rehearsing how to pronounce my name, and I'm just going to have to correct you, Jen. It's David Didau. I know. Don't feel bad. Nobody gets it right the first time. Anyway, listen.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. Thanks ever so much, everyone, for coming on. We're going to talk a little bit about accountability and about that idea of creating conditions for teachers to thrive. And we're going to start off by thinking about school improvement. Obviously, I say obviously, I'm sure you've all got answers to this question already. If you don't, there's a possibility you're in the wrong job. But rather than going into that, I've got a couple of, Jen called them challenges, a couple of sort of little provocations to ask. So this follow-up question to that first one: do all the systems in the school that you work, the institution that you work, if you're not in a school, do they contribute to improvement? And of course, we hope they do. And of course, we intend that they do, but do they? And that then leads to this next question, which is, how do we know? What procedures do we have for ensuring that what we think is actually helping is having the effects that we would like it to have? And that's important because of this POSIWID, which stands for this axiom that was the brainchild of Stafford Beer. And I've got a picture there of Stafford Beer, and I'm showing him to you because he looks bonkers, but there he is in all his bearded glory. He said the purpose of a system is what it does. And that sounds really sort of maybe a bit facile, but what he was drawing attention to that there is a difference with that to our intentions and our hopes. So the purpose of the system is what it churns out. And I think probably all of us over time have experienced, I'm going to take that last bullet point and the picture away for a moment whilst we concentrate here. We've probably all experienced systems which had unintended consequences. So some of you may remember, if you've been around for a few years, some of you may remember the days of the dreaded sub-level, where the expectation was that students would still awarded key stage levels in key stage 3, and that somebody at some point in the past had the idea that we could make this a bit more nuanced by having each level sub-level to A, B and C, and that schools develop data systems to track students' progress over time. And one of the perhaps unwritten, certainly not much discussed rules of such systems that children were meant to make upward trajectory of progress. And so what often happened in schools, what often played out, was that teachers would look at what sub-level had been awarded the previous term, and on the next data input session would simply award one sub-level higher, regardless of the performance of the students in question. And so the purpose of that system, often in many schools, was that teachers would be just making data up in order to please the people who were looking at it, and who could then assure themselves that, oh yeah, everything's playing out as we hoped. And then there are lots of versions of that. I think one of the things that I see a lot, hear about a lot in schools at the moment, is there's a real pressure, a real drive for students to do more extended writing. And you often hear senior leaders or trust leaders, or maybe even Ofsted inspectors saying, yeah, children need to do more extended writing. Now, I don't disagree with that per se, but let's think about the purposes of such systems. So if the purposes are that children do extended writing, that doesn't necessarily mean that they do high quality extended writing. And so we need to think about how we get what we want, rather than what will inevitably happen if we don't think about it. So what I see a lot in students' exercise books is pages and pages and pages of poor quality extended writing. And what we practice, we get better at. So if you do lots and lots and lots of poor quality extended writing, you get better at writing badly. Now, clearly, that's not in anybody's interest. Nobody intends or desires students to be worse at writing, but that's maybe an inevitable output to a system where what we're putting in is more extended writing. Instead, what we should perhaps think about is, how do we develop systems where we prevent students practicing badly? And that might lead to more of what we want. Anyway, so thinking about that idea of systems is important, and we'll return back to it. There's Stafford again, in case you missed him. So the final point on this first screen is one that you've probably heard lots and lots of times in the past, that the quality of an education system doesn't exceed the quality of its teachers. Nobody's sure who said that. It's in quote marks, but it's you can track it down to a McKinsey report, who in a footnote attribute it to an unnamed South Korean education official. So we don't actually know who said that. But I've in brackets there, I've suggested it's maybe more useful to think about teaching than teachers, and that's to acknowledge the fact that teachers are capable of teaching a real variety of quality of lessons in a given day, let alone over the course of a year, and that there are all sorts of contextual inputs that might affect what we do. So, our own physical health is going to have a view on that, but also, and this is the focus of today's webinar, the ways in which we're held to account are likely to have something to do with the quality of the teaching that we are capable of. So one of the things to debate and consider and to think about is whether teachers just get better over time, that you get in new teachers, and with experience they just get better and better and better. And there is a lot of research on that question, and there isn't a clear consensus, but according to value-added models which look at student achievement as a proxy for understanding teacher quality, this sort of graph does the rounds quite a lot. So this is the original piece of research done by Rifkin, Hanuchek and Kane 20 years ago now, where you can see, according to their value-added model, there's a really sharp rise in student outcomes relating to the length of teacher service in the first few years, which then starts to level off, and then maybe even after a plateau even starts to decline between 9 and 10 years. And that's kind of interesting to think about. And I think that sharp rise in the first few years makes sense. As we become more competent at some of the basic areas of teaching, as we learn how to run classrooms, then there is more order. and that's going to have a beneficial effect on outcomes. Almost certainly we'll become more confident and familiar with the specifications we're teaching. That will contribute, but maybe these benefits appear to wear off and perhaps even decline over time. So maybe we can't rely on teachers just getting better with experience. And so that, as a research question, ever since Rivkin and Hanicek and Kane first mooted that as a possibility, then it's been looked at by all sorts of other people. And Kraft and Pape are two American researchers that have really looked at this over the last 10 years or so, and this is probably their most famous paper from 2016, which is called The Myth of the Teacher Performance Plateau. And what they do there is, you can see the red line in the middle of the graph on the screen now is broadly identical to the one on the previous graphic that I showed you, but there are two further graphs, the green line, sorry, two further lines, the green line and the blue line. And what that shows, what they've done there is that they've untangled teacher performance and looked at attaching that to the characteristics of the schools that teachers find themselves in. And so that red line is an average of all teachers, but the green line and the blue line represent teachers in different types of schools. And so in the green line, you can see that everyone's following the same improvement curve pretty much at the beginning, but in the green line, we can see a much more sustained and a much more marked curve later on into teachers' careers, which looks really, really encouraging. So one of the things that they've done in this paper is unpicked the characteristics of green line schools, and most of these characteristics are not going to come as a surprise. So various things there that you might expect, like an ordered environment. So it turns out that students basically doing what they're told and being in a well-ordered environment is good. Who knew? Professional development. So the insight there is that if we put time and resources into teacher education, that's a good thing. You probably knew that. And then the third bullet point there is constructive monitoring. The idea of performance management is meaningful and fair, and that's obviously important, and it will connect with a little bit of what we're talking about this afternoon. I've isolated the fourth bullet point because I think it's particularly important, and you can see here that this is about mutual trust. Mutual trust, respect, openness, collaboration, and so on. And that seems to be a key characteristic of schools in which teachers are more likely to sustain improvement over the course of their career. So now the question becomes, let's unpick that a little bit and see how we get that. So before we do, I want to talk to you a little bit about domain characteristics. So I don't know if you've come across the idea of wicked and kind domains before. Essentially here, wicked and kind, they're not value driven words, they are descriptive of feedback environments. So in a wicked domain, what that means is you're getting the feedback you get on your performance is either missing or biased. And so because it's either missing or biased, it's harder to improve because it's harder to compare what you're doing now with what you need to do to get better, because the feedback isn't as you need it to be. And then a kind domain is the opposite, where you get clear and unambiguous feedback about how to improve. So a classic of the kind domain is meteorology. So if you're a meteorologist, obviously you're predicting the weather. And if you get that wrong, you get very, very rapid feedback on your mistakes. And it's very hard to be a meteorologist and not improve, because if the weather's different to what you've predicted, then you're going to have to change your predictive model. A good example of a wicked domain is radiology, or I should say it was a great example of a wicked domain. So a few decades ago, the world of radiology was researched, and one of the things that went into trying to look at the development of expertise in radiology was a study that looked at the difference between novice radiologists, those who'd been qualified for a year or less, and experienced radiologists, those who'd been qualified for 10 years or more. And so they looked at the ability of radiologists to correctly predict the presence of cancerous growths in mammograms. And what they found, much to their surprise, was that the performance of the novices and the experts was about the same. There wasn't a significant difference between the two groups, which is a bit of a shock, certainly in terms of their accuracy. Where there was a significant difference was that the experts were a lot more confident that they were correct, but no more likely to be correct. And what they found was that decades ago, what used to happen is that a scan would be taken of a patient, sent to a radiologist who would be in a different building. They would look at the scan, make a decision about whether there was a cancerous growth present, send their evaluation back to the doctor, who would never tell them whether they were right. So they'd never learn. They never got any better as a result of their professional practice. So teaching, I think, an interesting example of a mix of both of these domains. So some aspects of teaching are kind and some are wicked. So an example of where teaching is kind is with things like behavior management. So if you're struggling to control a class, if you're making decisions about how to intervene with student behavior, students very, very thoughtfully and kindly give you clear and unambiguous feedback about whether the choices that you've made were good ones. So you learn very, very quickly about what's effective and what isn't. And you moderate your responses based on that feedback. And most teachers get a lot better at running a classroom relatively quickly. Where perhaps teaching is more wicked is in things like the quality of instruction. So the goals of education are long term. What we're trying to do is, in an individual lesson, we're trying to get students to a point where they will be able to retain and transfer what we've taught them, sometimes years later, in an exam or in life or wherever. But the feedback that we're taking is on how good our efforts to do that, or how well they're received in an individual lesson. And so we look at students' performance in an individual lesson and think, are they able to answer the exit ticket question? Are they able to retrieve questions at the beginning of that in my do now? And if they are, we then take that as feedback that what we're doing is right and successful, even if we're not tracking that maybe months and years into the future. And so it can be very, very difficult for us to improve in the quality of instruction, because teaching, although it takes place in the present, the impacts and the effects take place in the future and elsewhere. So that's a real difficulty with the improving the quality of teaching. So I hope that makes sense. I hope that unpicks some of those graphs that we've looked at. If you want to look more at that, I've got a link there to a piece of research by Robin Hogarth, who really unpicks all of these ideas. So let's have a think about some of the things that happen in schools which get in the way of teachers thriving and getting better. And I think broadly, there are two things at play here. That sometimes as teachers, we feel that we're not trusted by the people who are in charge of us. And we're looking over our shoulders. We think, am I doing the right thing? Is it going to be approved of? And the other thing I think that really gets in the way systemically is the fact that there are just hoops to jump through, things to do that we don't think are worthwhile or valuable and don't contribute to student learning, but are there in order to check that what we're doing is what we've been told to do. And that, by the way, that's operating at system level as well. So if you're a school principal, you may well be feeling those things about the inspection process or the DFE. What gets in the way of you thriving is the lack of trust and the burdensome accountability that you experience in the system. So that in microcosm is felt within schools as well as in the macrocosm of what's outside. So why does this sort of thing happen? Is, if I'm right, a very pressing question. And I think that there are two things going on here. So the systems, which we've already talked about. So I'm making this claim that systems often have unintended consequences. And so it's really useful to think the purpose of a system is what it does, because that's a very brutal way of really like checking and evaluating, is what we're doing having the effect that we want it to have? So whenever you see teachers acting in unpredictable or eccentric ways, or students, the default assumption maybe ought to be, is there a systemic pressure that's causing them to act in this way? Sometimes there is. The other thing that's interacting with systems are forces, and the forces that we experience in education are things like, at the moment, we all agree that there is underinvestment. Maybe on Thursday that will herald in a great change. Maybe not. It doesn't seem, doesn't seem that there's going to be loads of money available. Also, things like we're generally agreed that we're experiencing a really tough recruitment and retention crisis right now. So there aren't enough great teachers to put in front of children, and especially in some subjects, and that's a force which is operating on the entire system, and it interacts with the systems that we put in place within our individual institutions. So the interplay of forces and systems is really important. We can't really control forces. We absolutely can control and tinker with systems. So with that in mind, I want to suggest that there are, broadly speaking, two models of school leadership, and these are very much caricatures. So I'm not suggesting that all schools fit into one of these two models, that most schools will have bits of both. And you'll probably recognize, as I talk through the characteristics of the deficit model and the surplus model, you'll probably recognize characteristics from places that you've worked. So in a deficit model, one of the guiding assumptions is that senior leaders have the view that things would be better if only teachers did what they were told. If only they worked harder, if only we could get them to implement our systems as intended, things would be better. And so with that kind of assumption, one of the questions that guides school improvement is to try and identify and assign blame and find out, if there's underperformance, who's at fault, and then address the point of fault at a human level. And that tends to lead in this caricatured extreme to ever tighter accountability systems, where we're giving more and more scrutiny to make sure that we've correctly identified whoever might be at fault. In a surplus model, on the other hand, the guiding assumption is that everybody who's working in a school is doing so with the best intentions. Now, having good intentions isn't enough. We all know what the road to hell is paved with. But if they're doing something wrong, they're not doing it out of malice. They're doing it because probably, often, there's a system which is getting in the way. And so within a surplus model, the assumption will be, if things aren't working out, let's look for the systemic obstacles which are causing people to behave in unexpected ways. Let's try and iron those out. Let's try and get rid of those. And then that then leads inevitably and inexorably to a system where there is greater trust, that people feel more trust because more trust is extended to them, and that is a virtuous circle, as opposed to the vicious cycle in a deficit model. So, as I say, those are caricatures. I'm not accusing any school of being one of these or the other, but it should be probably clear from the tone in which I went through those lists that certainly I'd want to work within a surplus model far more than I'd want to work in a deficit model, and most people, given the choice, would too. So we now need to think about, well, why aren't all schools surplus models? Why do we have deficit thinking in our system? And that then leads to this idea of intelligent accountability, which I'm going to unpick with you as we go through the webinar. So essentially, we experience the idea that of trust and accountability as opposing forces pulling against each other, and that we all kind of feel and recognize it's great to be trusted. We'd love to trust people, but what if they let us down? What if they don't do what we'd like them to do? So we need to have accountability to check that people if you know that we know what's going on, and that we get rid of bad actors, and that we find and identify problems, and they seem like they're pulling in the opposite direction. But the broad insight that I want to share with you is that they don't have to, and what you can do is try and bend those forces back on against each other and say, let's hold people to account for the trust that we give them. Now, maybe that sounds a bit facile, a bit too obvious. So what we're gonna do is have a look at what that might play out like within a school. So there are 5 principles I'm going to take you through, which I think are important for an intelligent accountability system. And they are, firstly, the importance of trust. Secondly, the importance of accountability. So we really do need accountability in order to be our best. That's it. So I'm not suggesting for a second we get rid of that. Thirdly, we're going to be looking at the interaction between those two, and thinking about the idea of mutual trust and the kind of things that would be in place within an intelligent system of accountability. We're then going to be confronted with this idea that equality is unfair. That maybe has led to your hackles raising. Maybe you feel a little bit dubious, like, am I in the right place? We'll come back to it. I hope you'll be happy with it by the time we finish, but at the moment I'm just going to leave that there, like a tank parked on your lawn, aiming its gun barrel at you, but we will come back to it. And then finally, the idea of earned autonomy. So that's the journey through the rest of the webinar. Right. Okay. First principle. So I want to extend a logical argument. There's a lot of research that suggests that working in an environment of high trust environment is really beneficial for productivity. That's true in all sorts of areas, not just education. But there's also a logical argument here, and I want you for a moment to think about the consequences of distrusting people. And I want to suggest that extending trust is a good bet. And so a model for this, I don't know if any of you are familiar with a French mathematician, Blaise Pascal, who very famously extended what has become known as Pascal's wager. And in this, what he did is he looked at the consequences of believing in God versus the consequences of not believing in God to decide what was the best course of action. And he said that if you choose not to believe in God, like, what are the consequences? Well, you might go to hell for eternity. If you choose to believe in God and you're wrong, what are the consequences? Well, you've just wasted some Sundays. So on balance, he said, going to church, acting as if God is real is a good bet, because the consequences of being wrong are so bad. And I think we can do something similar with trust. That what would happen if we trust people and we're wrong? Well, they let us down, and that's painful. And for the most part, most of the people within schools won't do that. Some will. Inevitably, that will happen once or twice. But what if we distrust everybody? What's the consequences there? Well, that's much more toxic. We've got a system in which nobody wants to work, nobody wants to stay. And against the background forces of retention and recruitment that we're experiencing, it's not a great strategy for long-term improvement. So on balance, trusting is a much better bet. It's much more likely to pay off with the majority of people. That's just a logical argument, but there is a massive research to support that as an idea. But I also want to talk about this idea of trustworthiness, because trust is two-way, as we'll look at. And in order for trust to work, we've got to be trustworthy. And I think there are 2 aspects of trustworthiness that are worth exploring. The first of which is expertise, and the second is honesty. Honesty is more straightforward. So at a basic level, it's don't make things up, don't lie. That's obvious, I hope. But more than that, it's about being realistic and not committing and saying you'll do things that you don't do. So under committing, under promising is, generally speaking, a better strategy than over committing and then letting people down. You can do that once or twice, but if you carry on doing it, people become very jaundiced very quickly. So instead, under promising but over delivering is it's much more likely to result in a happy workforce. So that kind of honesty, where you think realistically, what's the best what we can absolutely commit to. So, for instance, we look at something like Keir Starmer's promises and like things like recruiting 6,500 teachers, and we might well think, well, that's not very many. It's not as many as we need. But he's maybe got something there achievable. That if he does deliver on that, maybe we'll feel more trust for what he will then go on to do, and maybe he'll over deliver. Who knows? And if he does over deliver, we'll be delighted, but we won't hold him to account for not doing it because he hasn't said he will. So the other side of that is expertise, and that is the necessity that if people are going to trust you, you've got to be sufficiently competent and knowledgeable to be worthy of that trust. So if people don't think you're competent or knowledgeable, they just won't trust you. And we've probably all met, or I know I have met people who have been promoted into school leadership to get them out of the classroom because they weren't very good, and maybe they were brilliant at timetabling or something like that, and but terrible teachers, or that's the perception. And so if that is the perception, if there's somebody within a school who is viewed in that way, and they come into a lesson and go, well, you need to do something different in your lesson, why would you listen? Why would you take any account of their opinion? Because you don't think they're sufficiently competent or knowledgeable to give you meaningful feedback. So those two things interact really importantly, expertise and honesty. Right, now, I've been already talking about accountability a lot, so we're going to talk about it a bit more. I think at this stage I need to give you a definition, and this is the one that I'm using. And I'll just give you a moment there to see if you're happy with that. But there's essentially two key bits, and one of them is that if in a system of accountability you have to justify your beliefs or actions, and secondly that there are consequences for those actions and beliefs. So if you're happy with that, if you're not happy with that, if you don't think that's a good definition, that's okay, but at least you know what I mean by that. So that definition comes from Jennifer Lerner and Phil Tetlock, who've done a lot of research into accountability, and one of the things that I just want to draw your attention to on this slide before we move on is that what we're going to now be focusing on are these highly specialized subtypes of accountability. There are only relatively few things that actually make things better and create the kind of conditions that we want to have in schools. So if we want teachers thriving, which will almost certainly lead to students thriving, then we need to be mindful and thoughtful about what that stuff is. So that leads us now into principle 2. So everybody needs to feel accountable. We need to feel that we have to justify what we do, and that there are potential consequences for our actions. And that's important, because if we don't feel that those things are the case, then we maybe start doing things which aren't that great. And one of the things to say here is that the way human nature works is that nobody thinks they're a baddie. Everybody believes that they have the best intentions. The cognitive dissonance that we'd experience if we believed that we were evil is too great to bear. So everyone's able to rationalize and justify their own actions to themselves. We are very, very uncritical of ourselves. And so we'll come up with all sorts of reasons for explaining away our actions. And so that's important. So everybody, even Tory ministers, think they're good. And so that's important to know. So it's also important to ask and think about how people behave when they don't think anyone's looking. And you've probably seen those setups where there's a bulging wallet on the floor, and some people pick it up and pop it in their pocket, and some people look for who's dropped it, and then we make a judgment on whether they're good people or not. And that's right, that's important, but it's also worth feeding context into that, because it's much easier to be a saint if you're already comfortable. If you're worrying about how to put food on the table, it's much harder to pass up a bulging wallet. And so those kinds of things also need to be thought about and discussed and looked at when we're making judgments about people's behavior when they don't think they're being watched. But the way we behave when we don't feel like we don't think we're being watched is important too. So some people, it seems, often do the right thing and try to be good, not just look good. And so this is an important thing to think about. And it takes us back to that idea of Stafford Beer's axiom that the purpose of a system is what it does. And my contention is there are lots of systems in school, accountability systems, which encourage people to look good rather than be good. And I'll just illustrate that here for you. So this comes from Matthew Evans' great book, Leaders of Substance. I really recommend it if any of you haven't read it. And in here, he looks at some examples of what looking good versus being good might be like. So you've got the top row of that table there, that looking good is getting great results, but being good is making choices that are the best for your students' long-term outcomes. We hope that will result in them getting high results as well, but those are more about looking good than being good. You know, being popular versus meeting needs, all of these things. The last one, keeping up to date with marking versus keeping up to date with the quality that students are producing. And that's a very different thing that we don't really have time to go into today, but we could if we wanted to. So looking good versus being good. So what do we need to do then? If I'm making the claim about these systems being warping us and maybe unintentionally getting people to behave in ways we don't intend. So I mentioned earlier Jennifer Lerner and Phil Tetlock, and over the years they've looked at lots and lots of they've pulled together vast areas of research which have looked at these kinds of things. So firstly, they've investigated whether it's important that the audience in the research terms means the person holding you to account. So does it matter if what they like is concealed? Or is it better if they tell us what they like? And that does it matter whether the person holding us to account is interested in accuracy or just interested in ticking boxes? You might have a view on some of these things. They might seem obvious. Does it matter whether how well informed they are? Does it matter whether the subject, the person being held to account, does it matter that they know that? So should we tell them? And does it matter that that they know before they make a choice that there are going to be potential consequences for that? So these and lots of other things have all been researched. There are laboratory experiments which look at the behavior of people in lab conditions. There are field studies in lots and lots of different fields of expertise that look at each of these questions. And the results are in, and they're pretty unambiguous. And at least one of the things that I'm now going to tell you for principle 3, one of these things might surprise you. Some of them won't. Some of them are more obvious than others. So firstly, it turns out that it's really important that people know how they're going to be held to account before we go and judge them, before we hold them, before we force them into a choice. So it's not a great plan to leap out into a classroom and go, gotcha. If you thought it was, that doesn't lead to a system where there is mutual trust. I know, surprising. And number 2 is the one that if anything's going to surprise you, it'll be this thing. So it's important that the person who is holding us to account doesn't tell us what they want to see. Now, that might really trigger you. That might really make you think, hang on, what? That doesn't seem to make sense. And we're going to come back to that one for that very reason. The third one, much more uncontroversial. I don't think anyone will feel worried about this. That if you're holding someone account, you need to be expert and you need to be honest. And we've already talked about the importance of those things. So that is definitely important and fully supported by the research. So it's just number 2 that we need to unpick, that idea that if we want teachers to thrive, we shouldn't tell them what good looks like. So let's think about the consequences of saying to teachers this is what I want to see. This is what good looks like. When I look at in your books, I want to see 2 stars and a wish. When I look in your classrooms, I want to see everybody starting with 5 do now questions. And then I want to, at the end, I want to see exit tickets. And in the beginning, and all of this stuff. Now, the consequences, the best you get when you do this is compliance. People going, right, okay, that's what you wanted. Here it is. That's the best. Now, you might say, well, I'd be happy with a bit of compliance because it's chaos around here. And that's fair enough. I'm not saying that anyone should prioritize chaos over compliance, but you need to know that you're capping teachers' performance. You're preventing them from doing things which might be better than the ideas that you've got. And it's perfectly reasonable to suppose that some of the teachers in your schools are going to know more about how to teach their subjects in their classrooms to their students than you do. Not all, but it's perfectly possible that'll be true for some. And if you tell them, this is what I want to see, I'm going to be checking that you've done the thing that I've asked for, the best you get is that they go, here you go. But what you also get, and this happens a lot, is people pretending that they've done what you wanted them to do. And I have to confess, I was a bit like this myself as a teacher, that somebody would come into my room and they'd be with their clipboard, they'd be checking things, and I'd do the thing that I knew they were looking for, and then they'd leave and I'd stop doing it. And I'd go, oh, we won't do any more of that rubbish. And that's toxic, because that would be me distrusting the people who were holding me to account, but also then I create the idea that I'm not trustworthy either because I'm not doing what I've been told to do, and that then is the genesis of a toxic relationship. The other thing that you get is conflict, and there are other people who'll just fight you and go, no, you're wrong. We don't. 2 stars and a wish is rubbish. It doesn't have a good evidence base. Why are you making us do that? I've got a much better way of doing stuff than that. And they fight you, and inevitably most of them will lose, and they'll become dejected and resentful. And in a system where we are struggling to recruit and retain, they'll leave. And you're gambling that you're going to get somebody better to put in front of the classroom. Good luck. So those are the consequences of telling people what you want to happen. So I'm not wagging my finger here. I'm not saying you shouldn't ever tell people what you want to see. I'm just saying that it's worth exploring the consequences. And it's worth exploring this idea about consistency and to what extent that's important. So I think it's a really buzzy phrase. We talk about it a lot. I think that when we reframe that question and say, do you want every single teacher doing exactly the same thing in every single lesson? The answer is obviously no. Nobody wants maths lessons to look like PE lessons. Nobody does. We want to retain the unique characteristics of that. So I think it's useful for me to present those 2 graphics there and say, which model of consistency are you interested in? And for most of us, we're going to be interested in the idea, the metaphor that our school is an orchestra and we're creating beautiful music, and everyone in the orchestra has their own unique part to play, and we need to listen to each other, and we need to take cues and feed off each other, and we certainly don't start playing a different tune, but we each are acknowledged and valued for the difference that we bring to the whole. So is there a place for having a non-negotiable? And the brief answer to this is, of course there is. Of course there should be non-negotiables in schools, not least because some things are illegal. So would you negotiate whether it's okay for a teacher to hit a child? Obviously not. That's never negotiable. Should a teacher be able to negotiate whether they turn up to lessons on time? Again, clearly not. It's absolutely right and proper that we don't negotiate on things like that. Where I think we always should negotiate is on allowing teachers within properly understood frameworks to negotiate pedagogical and curricular choices. So we should listen when a maths teacher says that's not the best way to begin a maths lesson, or a MFL teacher says I'm not sure that that's the best way to do independent practice in a French lesson. We should listen, and we might not always agree, but we should negotiate. We should be willing to hear from the members of our orchestra about how they can best play their instruments. If we ignore that, I think that we're asking for trouble. So when it comes to pastoral choices, like should children line up outside of lessons, how should teachers meet and greet, those things, yeah, maybe you don't negotiate on those. Uniform rules, that sort of thing. Don't negotiate on that stuff. That's fine, maybe. But the stuff that is the characteristic of expertise within individual teachers and classrooms, I think, should always be open to negotiation. And that leads us now to the fourth principle, that equality is unfair, which I said maybe would feel a bit upsetting. But when I show you this picture, I'm hoping it no longer is upsetting. And you can quite clearly see why fair is better for equal for the figures in that graphic. That we should treat people according to their needs, not just give everybody the same thing. But I think this is a really important thing to state, that because in schools, typically, we have policies that are designed to be equal over fair. And that very often we'll design our policies because we know that there are some people in the system who are swinging the lead and we don't trust. So therefore, in the interest of fairness, we make everybody do the same thing. Nobody gets what they need, and teachers don't thrive. And so really, there's some nuance to that though. So it's worth thinking about equality and fairness as it connects to outcomes and opportunities. So you've got a job come up in your school. Should you let everyone apply for it? Yes. Yeah, that's fair. That's reasonable. There should be equality here. Should everybody get the job? No. The person you consider to be the best person is the person who should get the job. And that isn't fair necessarily. And that's certainly, it should be fair, but it isn't equal. You can't be equal when it comes to outcomes. What you should prioritize is fairness. And so that's the rule of thumb that I would encourage here, that opportunities are given equally, but outcomes should be what's fairest. And this really came home to me. This really struck home years ago, taking part in a CPD day at a school I worked in, where we'd all been asked to bring samples of our students' books to be looked at together in the school hall. And we were divided into tables, and we were looking through each other's books and filling in forms. And at the table I was on, there were two women looking through each other's books. And I vividly remember one of them turning to the woman that she was sat next to and saying, you could see she was furious. And she said, "You're the reason SLT treat us like shit." And which was a bit awkward. But she was looking through this woman's books going, "Oh my God, this is awful. It's appalling. No wonder we have these terrible marking systems, which I don't need because I'm always doing the right thing. And now I know why those have been put in place." And it was a really, really stark idea. And it leads us to this idea now of earned autonomy. So within a system, the people are really happy to share and to allow others to benefit from things that are unearned. So if you get a windfall, if suddenly someone comes up and goes, "Oh, here's £1 million, share this however," we'd like it shared equally. Everyone's happy with that. But if we think we've earned something, if we think we've put a lot of effort into something and somebody else isn't putting any effort into, if we've got a free rider, we really resent equality. And there's all sorts, again, I've put a link to some research here, which is quite interesting, which really illustrates the fact that people much, much prefer fair inequality over unfair equality. So within this system, earned autonomy is fair. So saying to people, look, we've got a system that's in place which treats people differently. And so far, you haven't earned the autonomy to be treated the way you would like to be treated. Now, it might seem hard. And so just really, really briefly, I think most people working in schools don't struggle to do this. If we think about the individuals in a school and think about the amount of effort they make and their level of expertise, we can plot people really quite quickly onto this graph. And I've got these 4 boxes here, which broadly are grouping different members of staff together. So the green box are your keen beans who do everything and come up with brilliant ideas, stuff you didn't think of, stuff you really, when you say to them, we've got this policy idea, they'll implement the spirit of it, not the letter of it, and they'll come up with great ideas. And you want to allow them to the freedom to do that as they interpret it. You've got other people like the blue boxes who are often new, really, really keen, they're like eager puppies. They'll work really, really hard, but they're not there yet. They need direction. It would be unfair to say to them, do what you think's best, because they're not expert enough to make the best choices. So you give them guidance. And then we've got the yellow box. And the yellow box are really, really interesting. These are staff who are real experts. They really know what they're doing, but maybe they're really fed up. Maybe they're underappreciated. Maybe these are the people who sit there going, yeah, we've done this before. It didn't work last time. And they're really irritating sometimes. And they feel underappreciated. One of the most effective ways of working with those kinds of staff is just deliberately going out and finding something that they're brilliant at and sharing it as widely as possible. Go and see Mr. Smith make dovetail joints. I tell you what, you'll never seen anything like it. Beautiful. Go and watch. Brilliant modeling, brilliant scaffolding. You'd need to see it. And the feeling of being valued, the feeling that their expertise is trusted, makes a huge difference to the way those sorts of staff operate within a system. And then we come to the sort of salmony coloured pinkish box. And these are the people that keep us up at night. These are the people that we feel are really unreliable. They're not working very hard. They're not very good at their jobs. Why would you design a policy around the lowest performing staff in a school? You need policies that meet with those people, but they need to be just applied to them. And I think that's really, really important. If our policy is one size fits all based on that box, then everyone's going to be resentful, and you will be crushing the spirit and destroying the trust that you're trying to instill in your school. So really, really quickly then, I'm going to close and allow some time for questions. I'm suggesting that trust and accountability shouldn't be things that pull against each other. They should be bent back on themselves, and that actually within an intelligence accountability system, you're holding people to account for the trust that you give them, and that you bear in mind quality versus fairness, you bear in mind earned autonomy, and you operate within a system in an intelligent way, tweaking constantly to get the kind of thriving, mutually trustful environment that you need in order for teachers to continue improving. So just to wrap up then, firstly, I'm arguing that those elements of the deficit model and where we're trying to assign blame and we're tightening accountability, they're a poor bet. They get in the way of teachers being their best. They might feel safer, but they're unlikely to pay off long term. I want to remind you that the purpose of the systems that you've got are the outcomes they produce, not what your lovely intentions are. So if your outputs aren't what you want, tweak your systems. There will be things that are wrong with them. Maybe some of the things that we fed into today's session might be really useful lenses to look at the systems that you've got in place. That the key knowledge is that your staff will behave best, will act best when they feel trusted and supported, and they know they are held to account in a trustworthy way, when they can trust you to be expert and honest and not to commit to doing things that you can't do. Treating people the same is always going to be unfair to everybody. And within that, it's absolutely fair and reasonable to say to some people, you haven't yet earned the autonomy to make the choices you'd like to make. Here is what you would need to do to make those, to earn that autonomy and to spell that out. I think that's completely reasonable. And there we are. So if teachers aren't happy, if students aren't successful, there's a really, really strong chance that something's gone wrong with your systems. And so this might be a really good place to start and think about how you might tweak those systems to get more of what you want and less of what you don't. I hope you found some of that interesting and useful. The book here, the grey book at the bottom, Intelligent Accountability, that goes into a lot more depth about these ideas. But if you've got some questions now in the last sort of 5-10 minutes or so, I'll be really happy to take them.
Thank you very much, David. That was really, really interesting. And I was reflecting on my own time in working in school leadership, and also actually my time here at AQA, because your principles apply far wider than school settings. The Q&A is open, so if anyone has questions, please do drop them in. I have a question which is about if there's any flex in the principles. So, for example, David and I were briefly talking about multi-academy trusts before the webinar started. And when you have a group of schools or schools at very different stages of school improvement, would there be a different approach you might take? Would any one of the principles be the priority? What are your thoughts on applying the principles to different improvement stages?
I mean, so 100%. So the principle that's most important there is to think about the fact that those last two, the idea that treating all of the schools within a trust in the same way would be probably a mistake.
Yeah.
That schools that are where students are doing really, really well and getting great outcomes and staff are really happy, why would you treat them in the same way that where schools are really struggling and there's chaos and, you know, blah, 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 blah. So that's important, so that you have earned autonomy within the system where you allow some schools to make more choices locally because, yeah, and you hold them to account for the trust that you're giving them. You don't just go off and make crazy choices. But the other schools, you say to them, look, things aren't good right now. You need to do it like this until it gets better. And maybe you make a judgment thinking about that third principle about the idea that, you know, that within that controversial idea of withholding your preferences, maybe that is, you know, if you've got a teacher that's flailing around and doesn't know what they're doing, then of course you don't withhold your preferences. You say, like, you've got no idea, do it like this, and you want them to comply with that because that's going to pay off much more quickly. But you don't take that view in that struggling school if you've got some teachers who are doing a fantastic job. You you would still try and identify and work with those teachers that aren't struggling to that degree. And maybe you don't have time. Maybe turnarounds, you know, so vital, so important that for the first 6 months of a school improvement journey, you just say, we're all going to comply with this. But then you have to, I think, if you want your school to continue to improve, to step back and say, where do we need to tighten? Where do we need to loosen? And start thinking as soon as you feel it's possible to extend more choice to those who've earned it. Does that make sense?
Thanks, David. That does make sense. Thank you. We've got a question popped in the chat from Nick. Given Ofsted are explicit in their preferences, does this hamper improvements?
Well, do you know, Ofsted are less explicit in their preferences now than they've ever been in the past. And one of the things that I feel kind of most professionally proud of was when an early iteration of the current inspection handbook was there's a bit in there which says that inspectors should be looking at, not looking for. And that was something that I advised be included. And I think that's a really, really important principle, because if you've got like a list of things and I'm ticking off the things that I hope to see, then that regularly and predictably leads to odd behavior. But if you're looking at what teachers are doing and then you use that to say, well, why are they doing that? Why are they making those choices? Sometimes you'll be surprised by the response and go, oh yeah, I hadn't thought about that. Brilliant. Yeah, carry on. And I genuinely, you know, I've in the trust that I work for has 42 schools, and in the last 3 years I've been involved in maybe 15 inspections, and with maybe one exception of an inspection that we weren't happy with, that all of the others that I've been involved with anyway have absolutely been conducted like that. And so I don't want to be like an Ofsted fanboy, because I think there are still lots of flaws and problems with inspections that You know, I'd really encourage people to look at a paper that John Coles from United Learning has just published about his ideas about what's working and what's not working with Ofsted. I think that's a great read, and I read through that earlier in the week and thought there was very little, if anything, that I would disagree with in that. But yeah, I think that they have made a great stride and a great effort to try and get individual inspectors to conceal their preferences.
Thank you. And we have one final question. We're just running up to the hour, but a question from Dan. Do you envisage a surplus model in the future regarding Ofsted, and what do you think it might look like?
Well, you know, do I? Yeah, I mean, of course, that's got to be the hope, hasn't it? Absolutely. As I say, I think that we're closer to that currently than we've ever been. But I think like there are things like the complaints procedure isn't fit for purpose. That's got to get a lot better. At the moment, it very much feels like they mark their own homework, and we wouldn't accept that if it was anybody else. So that's a big area of improvement for Martin Oliver to look at. And you know, but broadly, I think if they can, if with all of the problems that come with inspection, I do think that we all need to feel accountable, and just having internal accountability, I think, is a bit of a nonsense, that we wouldn't catch the schools where things have gone wrong properly in a model like that, or we're not good enough to be able to do that. So we do need, I think, external accountability systems. And if we didn't have Ofsted, I would be advocating for the existence of something like it. Can it be better? Yes, it absolutely can be better. And if we want it to be better, we should all be taking part. You know, they've recently had a big listening survey where they invited anyone connected to the profession to get involved and to give them their feedback. And I'm sure you all did. I'm sure you did that, Dan. Now it's up to them to really kind of sift through and listen and respond to all of that. But yeah, you know, absolutely. I will continue from the sidelines advocating for a surplus model of inspection for sure.
Thank you so much. Now we've come to the end of our time. I'd like to say a huge thank you to our guests and everyone who joined us this afternoon. Thanks to Phil and Nick behind the scenes. And thank you so much, David Didau, for presenting to us this afternoon. It's been a lovely way to end the working day. I wish everyone in the room today a brilliant end of term and a well-earned summer vacation, and hopefully your exam results will come out smoothly in August, and in the meantime, enjoy the summer. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jen.